Tak já bych vás přivítal u našeho druhého hosta. Děkujeme, že jste zase přišli. A další host je David Nixon. David Nixon is a pioneer in the field of space architecture. He founded the Studio Future system with Jan Kaplický. He has been involved in designing architecture in space and in extreme environments. He has worked on concepts for the US Orbital Laboratory, Skylab, and the ISS Space Station. He was involved in the development of robotic systems and spaceport planning. So give it up for David Nixon, and it's yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yep. Actually, half those things aren't true, but it sounds good anyway. I'd just like to start by asking you, how many of you are architecture students at this school? Put your hands up, right? Good. And those of you who are in the first year, put your hands up too. I'm just trying to get my bearings with the audience. Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to thank Ivana and her colleagues for inviting me here to Brno to come and give a lecture. I hadn't been here before. I was due to fly in yesterday, but I've missed my flight because of a security alert at the airport that I was leaving from, because I was intending to spend most of the day walking around your wonderful city. And that unfortunately didn't happen, so I've come more or less straight from Vienna airport, courtesy of somebody driving a very excellent car, which thank you very much indeed for the lift. So when Ivana first approached me about giving a lecture here, which I think was earlier this year in the spring, I started to put together a lecture on some of my own work that I was doing, that I've been doing recently in the space field. And this was at the end of May, and from the beginning of June onwards, in where I was living in southeast France, we had the most extraordinary climate event, which I hadn't experienced before in the 12 years I'd been living in France, which was where the temperature was consistently over 30 degrees centigrade, 30 to 35, for days on end. There was no rain for about 6 or 7 weeks, and the whole of the grass in the countryside turned brown. I don't know what happened here during the summer in the Czech Republic, but maybe you had the same thing. But that started me thinking, really, that what has happened this year, certainly in a large part of Western Europe, is the first real effects of global warming and climate change that we can feel at a street level, or a neighborhood level, or a community level, or a city level. I had not experienced that before. Before that, I was living in California, in Los Angeles, where we had fires every autumn, but the fires were way up in the hills behind the coastline, and to some extent we weren't affected by them. But I felt very affected by what happened this summer. And so I put my own work aside and put together this lecture on an aspect of global warming and climate change, which I thought might be of interest to you here in the Czech Republic, being a landlocked country without any coastline, to find out a little bit about what's going on around Europe's coastline and around coastlines around the world. Taking a long view, we have to start doing something about rising sea levels and preparing ourselves for them. We're able to try to produce short-term responses to global warming and climate change through things like what we do in buildings, through perhaps buildings that have greater shade, greater insulation, less glass, using heat pumps in winter or reverse heat pumps in summer. Various sustainable solutions to solving the short-term aspects of global warming and climate change. aided or not, as the case may be, by political programs in different countries. But the issue of rising sea levels requires a different approach. It requires a very long-term view, because this is happening imperceptibly. It's a little like a very, very slow-growing form of disease, a cancer, which you're not quite sure whether you need to do something about it now, or whether you can leave it a couple of years and deal with it then. And so what is happening now around the world, where coastlines are low and subject to flooding and high tides, is that some places, such as Miami in Florida, where this first photograph was taken from, are experiencing serious floods along property frontages that are worth a great deal of money, and already causing all kinds of problems with the future ability of people to live close to the sea in these kinds of situations. It's happening in Europe, it's happening in Britain, it's happening in many places around the world. So I put this lecture together to try to give you a flavor for what this emerging crisis is going to be like, not in my lifetime, but over the next 50 to 100 years, as the irreversible rise of sea levels takes place. And it is irreversible, by which I mean that physical forces have been set in motion right now over the past 10 to 20 years that will cause sea level rises because of the delayed reaction in the atmosphere and the seas. If we stopped emitting greenhouse gases tomorrow, it wouldn't make any difference to the sea level situation. It would take several decades for the world's climate to reach the point that it starts to have a beneficial effect on the sea level situation. And I think a very important point to make in the debate about sea level rises is a planetary one, because I think people who talk about global warming and climate change and trying to do something about it, or trying to resist doing something about it, tend to forget one thing, and that is that we are alone on this planet. We are absolutely alone in the universe. This picture of the Earth and the Moon was taken from the Martian surface, and I think it sums up extraordinarily well what a small planet we are. And here's another one. This was taken from the Martian surface, where Earth has disappeared almost practically. Just a pale blue dot in the middle of the screen there. We've discovered 5,000 exoplanets so far, more than 5,000 in different parts of the Milky Way. The nearest planetary system is 4 or 5 light years away, Proxima Centauri, and even if it had a habitable planet, we would never be able to get there except in several hundred years' time, because we simply don't have the ability to travel quickly enough. So we are absolutely alone, and if we mess up this planet and screw up its ecology, we have only ourselves to blame. The last big climate crisis was the Ice Age, from about 15,000 to 12,000 BC years ago, when the Earth cooled significantly, for reasons which aren't clearly known at this point. The general feeling is that it had something to do with a sudden release of carbon dioxide, which in fact had a contrary effect at that time in cooling the climate rather than heating it up. But the average global temperature during the Ice Age was about 8 degrees centigrade. Sea levels were 120 meters lower than today, which is a very difficult thing to conceive of, 100 meters below the present average sea level. The 20th century average global temperature was about 15 degrees centigrade, and average increased global temperature by May 2022 had climbed to 15.6 degrees centigrade. So if you look at the deltas between 14.8 and 15.6, and the 7.8 degree average temperature during the Ice Age, is that we are on track, I think, to disturbing the Earth's climate and global warming situation, the Earth's climate, to the sort of degree, if we carry on, that will produce the kind of cataclysmic results that the Ice Age did, but with temperatures on the rise rather than on the fall. So the next climate crisis really is the one that we're faced with now. How close are we to reaching the magic figure, the magic figure of 1.5 degrees centigrade, the apocalyptic figure? Well, in June this year, we had an average global temperature of 1.21 degrees centigrade, and the red line is 1.5, and we're creeping up each year. The prediction now is that as things stand, March 2034 is going to be the date that we reach that point. Now, the program for dealing with this at a global level is being handled through the United Nations, the so-called COPs conferences, and at the COP conference in Glasgow last year, around 200 nations signed up to increased climate action and greenhouse gas reduction targets, which followed the Paris Agreement of 2015, which was the world's first comprehensive climate consensus in which 195 nations agreed to take action. The Paris target was to hold the temperature rise to well below 2 degrees and preferably stop it at 1.5 rise. Coal, the worst cause of global warming, is to be phased down rather than phased out, with the language weakened by India and no timeline given. Current national plans on emission cuts, known as nationally determined contributions, will lead to a catastrophic 2.4 degrees centigrade rise, as predicted now by the science. So the outcome was that nations must work towards the 1.5 degrees centigrade target. And the next COP takes place in Egypt, I think, next month. And so we'll see what happens there. So that's basically the situation. What is the evidence for global warming and climate change? What is the evidence for sea level rises? Well, this slide was taken by satellite about 10, 12 years ago, and first started getting me interested in the whole issue of sea level rises. And this shows part of the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica that broke away in 2000 to form the world's largest iceberg, which was 295 kilometers long by 37 kilometers wide and bigger than the island of Jamaica. And I thought to myself when I saw this photograph, my God, you know, this is an incredibly serious situation that is beginning to take place, and nobody's paying much attention. So it took 20 years for this iceberg to drift into the South Atlantic, as you can see on the slide on the left here, up there, where it eventually melted and broke up and melted into smaller pieces. So these two photographs were taken in January and March this year, and they show a section of ice shelf in East Antarctica disintegrating. Those photos are roughly 110 kilometers across from side to side. And you can see here how this whole area of shelf has just disintegrated here too, and around here, breaking up into icebergs and ice flows and floating off into the Atlantic, and up here too. So in the space of just 2 to 3 months, that had happened earlier this year. It was caused by exceptional air temperatures that increased to 40 degrees above normal, and that was for Antarctica. paper published in the magazine Nature in September 2020 points out that half the Earth's fresh water is contained in the Antarctic ice sheet. This represents the largest potential source for global sea level rise under future warming conditions. The paper concludes that if the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures is not met, critical melting thresholds may be crossed in Antarctica that may result in, quote, long-term, possibly irreversible sea level rise of up to dozens of meters. Paper published just a couple of months ago on the volume of ice loss in Greenland projects 110 trillion tons of ice melt, producing a minimum sea level rise of 0.27 meters. This will now happen regardless of whether temperatures are controlled or not. Sea level rises in the United States. Expected average rise around the US coastline is now 0.25 to 0.3 meters up to 2050. Higher global temperatures may increase sea levels up to 2.2 meters by 2100 and up to 3.9 meters by 2150. It's hard to believe, isn't it? Hard to believe. So the 2 degree temperature rise limit is the temperature rise limit above the pre-industrial temperature. You see the graph on the left starts out at about 1860, I think, and then rises, and this shows the rise over that period. I'm leaving this lecture behind, so if any students are interested in going through it again, they can get a copy of the organizers here. So 1850 it started here, and then it started to rise in the early 1920s, 1930s, and is up here now with something like a 0.8 degree rise above the zero of 1860, of the late 1800s. So it's really a global average temperature prior to the impact of the Industrial Revolution. And the graph shows that since 1860, it's risen about 1.2 degrees, which leaves a margin of about 0.8 degrees before the 2 degree centigrade limit is reached. And this graph shows observed sea level rises produced by the European Environment Agency since 1880, drawn from 3 sources. Green and red lines from tide gauge data, which they started using in the late 19th century. And then with the emergence of satellites, the blue lines, the blue line takes over towards the right. And that is showing, again, a major rise in observed sea levels, observed sea level rises. Now, the causes of sea level rises, it's not just the issue of melting snow and ice, it's also the expansion of water in the seas and oceans, which expands in terms of volume slightly as it heats up. So you put those two things together, and those give you the figures or the means by which you measure. Those are the 2 sources, which, when you add them together, gives you the means by which the sea level rises are taking place. And there's an interesting projection tool that NASA, the space agency, has now produced that you can go online to play around with, which will give you an idea of the risk factor of future cities on coastlines around the world. It's an interesting thing to do and rather alarming, actually, when you just start picking figures from this. So this tool shows projected rises for the decades up to 2150 based on different greenhouse gas emission rates. Taking New York as an example, it shows a rise of 0.35 meters by 2050 and 0.93 meters by 2100. So you can get the picture, can't you, of how all this data is beginning to come in from these different sources now, and showing what is actually going to happen in the decades ahead. And the most recent and accurate means of monitoring sea level rises is this satellite system, part of the Copernicus system. Europe has developed a new ESA-developed satellite launched in November 2020 to monitor the world's oceans, which monitors sea level accuracy to within a few centimeters. And its results will add weight to the growing body of evidence of the now inevitable sea level rises. Right, so I've been talking so far about the evidence, what the evidence is behind the problem that is growing. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what the challenge is and how we can deal with it. And one of the things here is that I want to stress is that a lot of the approaches towards mitigating or solving the sea level rise involve design, architecture, and engineering. And if there's one thing you could take away with you from this lecture when I finish today, it's the idea that when you train to be an architect, you don't necessarily have to build buildings on the ground. You can build buildings that float. And in future, this is going to be a big new opportunity field for architects. So the United Nations has an organization called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the world's leading authority on climate change, produces reports on a regular basis, and reports are informed by scientists around the world who carry out local observations, local research, local calculations. It's all pooled together, synthesized, processed, reviewed, and then published in reports. 10 years ago, roughly when they started doing this, they were considered a bunch of cranks, right? They thought, well, you know, what do these people know about what's actually going to happen with their, their data? But what has happened since then, after a series of reports have been validated by data that has been observed, is that now people have turned to the United Nations as the main source of information about monitoring climate change and global warming. And this particular report they published in 2019, which deals with the oceans and the cryosphere in a changing climate. Back then, they were projecting a sea level rise of 0.43 to 0.84 by 2100, which ties in with some of the figures that I mentioned before. After 2100, seas will continue to rise for centuries and will remain high for thousands of years, right? You remember that first slide I showed of the Ice Age, where sea levels were 112 meters below what they are now? So we're talking about big figures here. We have no idea what is going to happen to the sea in the future, whether it's going to end up 2 meters higher, 20 meters higher, or whether it's going to mirror the drop in the sea level of the Ice Age that took place all those thousands of years ago. We're basically coming back to the point I made right at the beginning. We are alone, and if we mess things up and turn the climate into a kind of runaway ecological disaster, we have no place to turn to, nowhere to go. We have to solve it now. Anyway, this report, which you can download, as you can all the reports from the IPCC, well worth reading, very good data, very good background research for projects that touch on architecture. So in this report, they come up with 6 approaches to tackling the problem in this very simple diagram. This is their diagram, it's not mine. So first of all, in the top left corner, you have no response. No response. You don't do anything. You just let the sea levels rise, and then you either drown or your house collapses under you, your waterfront disappears, and you have to go and make a new life somewhere else. The second one is advance. Here, where you build a monolithic water barrier of some sort, a breakwater, in front of the development, and hope that that will and hope that that will keep the seas back from the development that you already have. Very expensive, time-consuming solution. The third one is protection, which is essentially a smaller version of what I've just mentioned here, where you build a seawall without any development on it, a simple seawall to hold back the water. The fourth one is retreat, where in fact you take your development, if you can, existing development, and rebuild it or move it to higher ground that is well away from any risk of future flooding from the seas. The fifth one is accommodation, and this is really where architectural input is required, because what you're talking about here is staying over the water as it rises and somehow solving the problem architecturally, either through building up on a substructure that goes down into the seabed, it's fairly conventional, or through some sort of floating structures, and floating homes would actually go up and down with the water, with the tide, or even amphibious ones which float at high tide and sit on the ground at low tide. So there are all kinds of opportunities here for design. And the fifth one on the right is ecosystem-based adaptation, where you use natural vegetation that works well at mitigating the force of sea level rise, not necessarily the rise itself, but the impact it produces through vegetation using indigenous plants and other forms of vegetation like mangroves, seagrass and things to help reduce that effect. And then of course you've got a synthesis of all these different approaches. You can have different combinations to tackle specific situations, particular geographical situations which don't necessarily suit one particular approach. So let's look at these in turn. The first one is no response. So this is an example of no response. Malibu in California, which is the home of the film stars, on the California coast. And as you can see here, it's a ribbon of development stretching along a very exposed part of the coast. It's very low level here, and this is what's happening now already. These homes are basically stick-built wood-framed homes sitting on wood piles that go down on foundations, and you can see high tides already beginning to sweep the base of the steps down. So older coastal residential sites like this one was built in was built from the 1920s onwards, are going to be swallowed up by the sea unless the owners can redesign these their homes to survive rising sea levels. Well, here you're dealing with film stars with vast financial resources, so maybe they will do that, and time will tell, or maybe they will desert the waterfront and go and build somewhere else higher up on the ground. But in a situation where nothing happens, that is typical of a no response. Another no response, this is in Britain on the west coast, the province of Wales, on the west, to the west of England, between England and the Irish Sea. Very low-lying community, basically a large village where the government has said that it will be uninhabitable by 2052 and will have to be abandoned. The government is not prepared to spend any money supporting this particular community, and it's going to have to cope for itself. There is in fact a seawall, as you can see along there, at the back of the sands, but it's not anything like enough apparently to be able to deal with up to 0.5 meter of sea level rise. This is what would happen in New York if there was no response. You can see the flooded areas, the light blue areas on the right. This is what New York would look like with a 1.8 meter sea level rise using the interactive guide I mentioned before, where large portions of Newark, New Jersey, here on the left, here on the left, the Manhattan waterfront around here, and the area here, Brooklyn, and particularly the John F. Kennedy Airport strip here would all be seriously affected. And New York does have a plan in action that they have begun to try to address this in the future, which I'm going to show a slide from that in a minute. The next one is advanced, where you go out into the water with some kind of structure, reclaimed land, or whatever it happens to be, on which you build something or other of use. And this is an example of an airport, Kansai Airport in Japan, which was designed by the Renzo Piano office, built on reclaimed land in Japan. Since it opened in 1994, the airport ground has sunk 11.5 meters from the original level. Now, this was predicted by the engineers over a 50-year period before stabilizing at 4 meters. They knew that there was going to be major settlement on that site. But parts of this airport construction have reached that threshold in just 6 years, which required the construction of a perimeter wall all the way around the main airport area to protect the runways and the buildings. So who knows? That wall is apparently keeping out the highest tides at the moment, but with rising sea levels, one doesn't know what is going to happen. So this is a project that I was involved with in the mid-1970s, also with Jan Kaplitsky and Eva Jurikna. They were all of us were working for this, for the architect that developing this project at the time, which was a very large marina built out into the English Channel from the coastline of the south of England. And because of the tidal range in the channel, which is 5 or 6 meters, very high tidal range in the English Channel, because the coastlines of France and Britain converge at the Dover Straits, and that convergence causes the tides to rise as the current comes in from the Atlantic. So what they did was to develop the thing as two parts. One was a tidal basin for yachts here, and the other was what is now become a development of housing. But way back then was a locked basin for yachts too, and right at the end were the lock gates. And the construction form they used to protect the both basins really from the effects of the very severe effects of winter storms on in the English Channel with combined winds and high tides, was to build a system of concrete, reinforced concrete caissons coming out from the shore here all the way around to enclose the whole area here, with one entrance here. And then there was an area called a spending beach, which was a slightly sloped surface at the back of the entrance, which was designed to lessen the effect of waves before they entered the marina waters. Well, this was built with reinforced concrete back in the 1970s, and it hasn't lasted particularly well. 50 years later, 45 years later, whatever it is, there is now serious corrosion of the concrete, and particularly the deck. The deck that runs around on top is corroding away quite badly and is having to be replaced. So the lesson there is reinforced concrete is really in the long term, if we're talking about 50 to 100 years, reinforced concrete is not the solution, apart from the fact that concrete is a terrible producer of carbon dioxide, both in its production and its construction phase. Reinforced concrete structures were built around the coastline of Europe by the Germans during World War II, and there's evidence left, certainly along the coastline of France, of how they deteriorated over the years since 1945. So over 100 years, completely useless, basically. So reinforced concrete, apart from the fact of its sheer cost of it, is not necessarily, or maybe not even at all, the long-term solution for what you call, what the United Nations call advanced barriers of considerable size on which you want to build something. So the next category is protect, and the example I've used here is the sea wall that protects Cherbourg Harbour on the north coast of France, which began construction under Louis XVI in the late 18th century. It was interrupted several times by the removal of the Ancien Regime, the fall of the monarchy, the French Revolution, and then the Napoleonic Empire that produced, that lasted until around about 1815. And through all that, they pressed on with this project. And there's a section here from one of the original reports that I will try and describe. Again, it was an extremely exposed site on the north coast of France, sitting out in sticking out into the English Channel. So they started with a system of rocks, just loosely deposited rocks, on the seaside on one side, with a fairly gradual slope, and then a steep slope on the other. The idea being the rocks would, again, slowly reduce the force of the waves before the waves reached the top of the barrier and spilled over to the inside. And they found they were getting up till about 1800 immense movement in these rocks caused by simply by the tides pushing the rocks up the slope and over the top. And so for several years they continued to repair what every winter was causing all kinds of problems. And by round about 1845, they had developed waterproof cement in France. And the use of waterproof cement also enabled them to build a structure. Actually, this began under Napoleon's time, used as a mount for cannons to resist British attacks on the harbour. The original point being that what France wanted was a safe, sheltered anchorage on its north coast, from which it could sortie out with its fleet to attack British convoys in the Channel. So that was the plan. And by the time of Napoleon's demise, they were building these platforms out of stones with seawater-resistant cement, and they worked quite well. And they also tended to stop the movement of the rocks over the back of the slope. So anyway, what began as a military project at the end of the 18th century ended up as a commercial project by the mid-19th century, when the final wall was opened by Napoleon III in the presence, ironically, of Queen Victoria, who came over from Britain, as a superb demonstration of really, at that time, pre-industrial construction. They began the project using sailboats to move the stones and then deposit them in place. And by the time they'd finished the project in around about 1850, they were using steamboats and railway tracks to speed the situation. Now, this project wasn't designed for rising sea levels. It was designed to resist the high tides and strong waves of the English Channel. But compare this to the project we've just seen with reinforced concrete. There is no doubt that simple masonry, cleverly deposited with a minimum of additional manufactured materials using stone, locally quarried stone, is far better at resisting the sea in the long term than reinforced concrete. So that's an important lesson for the future. This is the Thames Barrier in London, which was built from 1975 to 1982. Engineering performance data based on predicted high flood tides, 100-year floods up to 2030, but did not consider any future sea level rises. And what they're finding now is that they have to raise the barriers between the structures, submerged barriers, more and more frequently to prevent high tides from passing up the Thames to central London, particularly during winter at spring tides, high spring tides driven by North Sea winds. When you get a high tide with the wind forcing it up the River Thames, that's the most risky time. I mean, I remember some years ago, I was sitting in a pub in South London on the river called the Mayflower, very historic pub, having lunch, and one of these high tides came in, and the floor of the bar was next to a terrace which was built out over the water down into the riverbed. And I was sitting there drinking my beer. The water appeared over the top of the terrace deck and started seeping into the bar across the floor. And I thought to myself, it's going to be like this every week in the future in this particular pub. Here's another example of Protect. This is a town on the south coast of Britain that suffered a very severe storm damage and washed away a section of retaining wall at the back of the sand and exposed and also washed with it the aggregate and rocks beneath two railway lines that fed the whole coastal communities along the Devonshire coast. And this is what happened. And 2 years later, they had rebuilt that with a fairly standard reinforced concrete wall sitting on a deep footing well below the sand. So we'll see whether that survives or not. So the real masters of dealing with the sea, I think, are the Dutch, it's fair to say, historically and certainly today, that the Netherlands has devised all kinds of techniques for protecting its very low terrain affected by floods from the North Sea. And the biggest construction is this one, the Oosterscheldekering, here on the left. An amazing piece of engineering. I haven't actually visited it, but it is very impressive with, again, a series of barriers which, with movable gates, which are deployed during high tides, 9 kilometers long, of which 3 kilometers comprises the movable gates. So the barrier is closed once a year on average when the sea level is predicted to rise to 3 meters above what they call their local normal Amsterdam level. So it may be able to withstand sea level rises up to a certain limit. There is enough margin there, providing the barriers are gradually permanently closed. System of locks will then be needed for ship passage. If the barriers have to be closed most of the time, ships can't get through, so then you introduce a lock passage or a couple of them. but whether it can deal with high tides and storms that accompany rising sea levels 50 years from now, nobody knows. And then, of course, you've got the famous example in Venice, the MOSE project, the MOSE Lagoon Barrier barrier project in Venice, to protect the lagoon from high tides and storm surges in the Adriatic. This project was very heavily delayed by technical and political and management problems, eventually completed in 2020, and now proved that it works well after holding back flooding 2 years ago. So the barrier compartments work on the same principle as ballast tanks in submarines. That is to say, they're fully flooded when the barrier is submerged on the seabed, blow all the air out, blow the tanks, and when the sea level rises, you pump air into the compartments to purge the water, and up they come. Very simple concept. And maybe that's one of the major solutions to sea level rises and tidal rises in the future. We'll have to see. You see what I mean about the design input that is such an important aspect of some of these ideas. This is a perfect example of it. And there's no reason at all why architects can't get involved in leading projects like this. So the next category is retreat, where you give up essentially living on the coastline that is now being flooded on a regular basis, and you move all the development further inland. And this is an example from Japan, from the city of Higashimatsushima. I hope I've pronounced that right. There was a bad tsunami there in 2011 that caused a huge amount of damage to this stretch of coast, and the cities affected planned several new towns and residential areas beyond it. You can see what they've done. These were, the blue were the flooded areas from the tsunami. A lot of the existing coastal communities were flooded out, which is the red development. And what the local planning authorities have done now is to rehouse a lot of the former residential communities in sort of higher density areas further back from the coastline. So that's an example of retreat. Here's another one, the Marshall Islands in the Central Pacific. At very great risk. 1,000 islands spread over 29 coral atolls in the Pacific, less than 2 meters above sea level, fewer more than a mile wide. The population is around 50,000 living at high density on some of the islands, as shown in this the photographs on the right. So the nation is now developing an adaptation plan that may involve relocating its entire population to the USA, in whole or in part, by agreement with American government in return for historical use of the islands for military and nuclear testing purposes. What happened is, in the 1950s, is that the American military did a lot of their nuclear bomb testing on some of these atolls in the Marshall Islands in return for this future commitment to support and sustain the population of the islands should some disaster like rising sea levels happen. So this may end up as being one of the first examples of a complete relocation of a nation from one part of the planet to another, because the part they were living in before has become completely uninhabitable. Now, the next one is accommodate, and this, I think, is where architectural input has particular value. This is an example of a floating community in Sausalito, California, across the San Francisco Bay from the San Francisco city. in this scenario, buildings are adapted to respond to rising sea levels by raising them above the water or designing them to float. Okay? So back to my point about the fact that if you are engaging in architecture as a career, just stop thinking of buildings as things you build on the flat ground, right? And open up your vistas to include other possibilities. This is absolutely vital. This is an area where architects and architectural schools can make a real difference. So Sausalito in California has a floating community of around 400 homes, like the ones shown on the right. And as you can see, everybody likes to do their own thing, don't they? All sorts of different styles going on here. And they're all basically built on concrete flotation units filled with polystyrene foam. Absolutely extraordinary. And the amazing thing is that the price of these places, I've been around visiting some of these, they start at $600,000 US and rise up to 3 million. And that slide actually is 10 years old, so you can add, you know, maybe $1 million onto both those figures for today's prices. It's basically, it's operated by a homeowners association. It has nothing to do with the local government or the local city. It's an entirely self-governing community. And as you can imagine, some of these places, some of these homes have been here for a long time, since the 60s and 70s, getting a bit run down. They're all connected up for you through utilities, main drainage, electric power, telephone, everything you want. So that's very much something for the future. Of course, it's fair to say that the stretch of water on that side of San Francisco Bay is very calm. It's quite sheltered. San Francisco Bay generally is fairly calm. Only in the most extreme weather conditions in winter do you get you know, waves building up inside the Bay Area, coming in through underneath through the Golden Gate Bridge. So that's a historical example of accommodation of not sea level rises, but floating homes on the sea. A much more recent one is this one in the Netherlands by the Dutch firm of Marlies Roma. As you can see, basically it's a fairly modernist housing development floating on the water rather than sitting on foundations on the land, and supported on some kind of similar, what looks like a fairly lightweight, maybe wooden timber-built substructure. So they're prefabricated in a factory, towed to the site by tugboats, moored in position along floating walkways and connected up to public utilities lines. Again, they're in a fairly calm environment. The Zuiderzee is protected from the Atlantic and the North Sea, protected from the North Sea by the project I showed earlier, the great 3-meter-long series of sea barrier elevated moving barriers that connect between the concrete platforms. So it's a fairly calm stretch of water. Another example from the Netherlands is this one in Maasbommel. This is slightly different because this is an amphibious design in which the homes actually rise up and down with the tide, guided on piles. You can see a pile here in the middle. This is taken at low tide with the substructure of the home sitting on I don't know what that is under there. Maybe it's a concrete bed of some kind, or a compacted gravel bed. Sitting on here and then rising up twice a day, whatever it is, with the tidal increase. And that's going to be the first challenge, because sea level rises are going to be a very gradual thing. And the first thing that is going to happen is that homes, buildings along the sea fronts in affected areas are going to be affected by seawater coming in intermittently at high tide, and then the water will flood out at low tide. So from an architectural and engineering standpoint, what you're going to start off with are homes that can rise up and fall twice every 24 hours, quite happily, with the utilities connections articulated and hinged to enable that to happen. You know, it's not rocket science, it's a very simple thing. And what we need to do as architects is just to switch our minds to the whole idea that we're building on a liquid rather than a solid foundation. So the final category is to ecologically adapt. And this perhaps is truly the greenest approach, where you're trying to use natural vegetation and plants in their local habitats to do the job of mitigating the force of the sea. You can't really use these for reducing sea levels, but you can certainly attenuate the wave motion and calm it down, so that by the time the water does get to development on the inside, it will be much calmer to deal with. It's a case of using more than one technology, more than one approach. So you could use an ecological adaptation approach as a front line, and then by the time the water hits your amphibious structures in the previous slide, it's calm all the time. And so that eases the design of the structure, the floating structure that you're going to build, and reduces the motion of the house caused by the wave action. So mangroves are very effective. Mangroves grow in tropical and subtropical latitudes. They put down their own roots into the sea or riverbed, mostly effective in what they call brackish water areas between fresh water and seawater, such as estuaries of rivers like the Mississippi River in the United States, or the Everglades in Florida, somewhere like that. So underwater dense mangroves can help to bind the soil and stop the soil erosion caused by wave action, and slow the water down. If you slow the water down, that's the first thing to do. Build up the soils every time. The mangroves contribute towards fish life and the preservation of ecology, aquaculture in the seas, and as they degrade and decay, they continue to reinforce the soil underwater. So it's a self-regenerating process, best combined with other defensive measures. Another example of wetlands and marshes. These photos are taken from Louisiana, which faces the Gulf of Mexico. Louisiana is very low in the water. You see that slide on the left there shows a series of tidal islands or flats, which are at low tide there and would be submerged at high tide. So in Louisiana, there were two major hurricanes that caused immense damage and loss of life in 2005, one called Rita and the other called Katrina. And that resulted, and particularly in New Orleans, that was affected at that time, causing the state of Louisiana to begin a program of wetlands restoration and expansion. So Louisiana is taking the natural approach. Strategic conversion of around 1% of the agricultural cropland to wetland, proving flood resiliency for local communities. So you convert excess cropland, farmland, to wetland, and that allows the water, the higher water, to come into the land and be absorbed by the new soil. But as with mangroves, it's not a standalone solution. It has to be used with something else. And finally, New York City, which has a big problem. And so this is the Danish architect Bjork Engel's idea for how the Manhattan waterfront might be protected to some extent from very high seas in the Hudson River. And he's proposing a system of floodable parks along here, which also have a leisure function when they're dry. You build that out into the Hudson River in front of the present waterfront and the roads, and that will absorb the excess water when the water level overtops the outer mark. So it's again another attempt to slow down the water and absorb it before it starts to do real damage to the water line at the back. So here again is the diagram I showed earlier, which is probably the most important slide I'm showing this evening. Very diagrammatic, not particularly informative, but this shows the 6 options, well, 5, because no response is not an option really. You forget about that. The 5 options really that can be brought to bear to deal with the sea level rise problems over the next 50 years. And as you can see, 4 or 5 of those involve design, 4 or 5 of those involve architecture potentially. So it's a new field. This is the new field that is opening up for us. So, just talking for a moment about Europe. The challenge for Europe is that it's got a huge coastline, 58,000 kilometers long, apparently, stretching all the way from Finland, round the Baltic, out into the English Channel, North Sea, down past the coast of France, round Spain into the Mediterranean, all the way down. There's the Aegean and Greece and all the rest of it. Can you believe that? 58,000 kilometers long coastline, 3 times the length of America's and twice the length of Russia's. So planning a pan-European response to the sea level threat must begin now. Countermeasures should be funded and managed by the European Union through a phased-in budget established for the purpose, I believe. This would ensure that low-lying nations and regions most at risk are not left to survive and adapt without pan-European help. European Union countries without coastlines should help those with. If you are part of the problem, you have to be part of the solution, right? And here in the Czech Republic, you're burning a lot of coal in power stations, right? So you are you're part of the problem. You're a big part of the problem. So this is, the thing is that Europe has the structure of government and the structure of regional organization through that is the perfect vehicle for enabling a common cohesive approach to take place. So much as Europe is right now trying to deal with the issue of extremely high natural gas prices by coming down heavily on the profit margins of the fossil fuel companies, it can equally start to muster the organization needed to begin with tackling the sea level rise problem, so that countries that are most at risk, like the Netherlands, get help from countries like the Czech Republic. Now, this is only beginning to impinge on European thinking at the moment, and I've been through the documents of the European Union dealing with the environment, European Environment Agency it's called, and they are barely beginning to tackle this situation. So we need new ideas, and just finishing up with 2 examples which, from my own interest really. This is how they do it in Venice, right? Every time they have a flood, they come out with these things that look like restaurant tables, outdoor restaurant tables on legs. And this is St. Mark's Square. Put them down in a line, incredibly unsafe, dangerous, slippery, you know, risk of children falling in, absolutely hopeless in many ways, difficult to install one by one across stretches of water. Right? So about 10 years ago, I thought, well, maybe I should get involved in this subject. And the first thing I thought of was really what they do in airlines, an aircraft for emergency evacuation using inflatable evacuation slides like these examples from the A380, which self-inflate over the wing or straight out of the fuselage down into the water. And I thought maybe there's something there that could be adapted to a similar sort of self-deploying situation. So I came up with this idea. There's really nothing new about it. It's basically an updated version of a pontoon bridge. Pontoon bridges go back to, I don't know, medieval times, I think, maybe earlier. Pontoon bridges basically are walkable or drivable decks, cyclable decks that sit on boat hulls or inflated tubes of various kinds, be they metal, solid, or in this case inflated. So I came up with this idea, which is a containerized approach where you have the thing sized to fit inside a shipping container, right? So two of them in one 13-meter container. And then out it comes on the water, and you press a switch, or you get your iPhone, your iPad, and you signal the actuators to deploy springs to extend the thing out of the water as the tubes inflate, and you end up with a walkway that looks like that. But that's not all, because what you then do is the walkway is fitted with guardrails which flip up from the center of the walkway like that. There's nothing special about this. It's just basic trying to produce a design which is easily deployable, self-deployable. Those would have to be done by hand probably after the main lengths have inflated. And then you take some sections out and you can put in, you can start to build an infrastructure at 90 degrees through very simple joints that connect the sections at right angles. And that's a detail, and you have sort of high-strength netting for the sides. Very lightweight, very strong, very simple. So that's just one idea I came up with, I don't know, 12 years ago, I think it was, and then forgot about it. And then recently, I wanted to talk to you about the final example tonight, which is Tuvalu, which is another very high-risk, island in the Pacific, which consists of 3 reef islands and 6 atolls, the total land area of 26 square meters and a population of 12,000. Maximum elevation 4.6 meters above average sea level, and an average lagoon depth of 36 meters, which really makes the lagoon in the middle, as we'll see in a moment, too deep for construction. Food security, well, it basically doesn't have any now. Substantial food imports are essential to keep the island going. So they now predict that 20 to 40 centimeter rise will make the islands uninhabitable. And as we've seen earlier in some of the evidence slides that I talked about at the beginning, that 20 to 4 meters is right on the cards now. So this nation is going to disappear unless somebody does something about it. So just out of interest, I did a little calculation here showing how it could be turned into a floating nation. Using figures for agriculture, the amount of land area needed to sustain a single human being, which varies considerably from 5 square meters to 10 square meters, and actually goes much lower to 2 or 3 square kilometers per person. I'm sorry. Okay, forget what I've just said. The figures are of the order of 1 hectare per person. For the amount of land needed to grow crops of cereals, fruit and vegetables needed to sustain 1 person with some animal use, such as chickens, no major animals like cows, 1 hectare per person. So 12,000 times 1 hectare gives you all those green circles. I've just used circles to illustrate the point. I'm not suggesting they should be designed as circles, with the population in the middle of the circles, so that you have, in fact, you have 2 levels of protection for the, so first of all, as the sea levels rise, you use the old lagoon islands as breakwaters to attenuate and reduce the wave action from the Pacific. And then secondly, the water hits impacts the areas of growth of plants. So you have floating fields. Those floating fields have to be designed to withstand both wave motion and also overtopping around the edge from waves hitting the structure. And then you put the accommodation right in the middle, where it has the most protection from both the lagoon, both the now submerged islands, which are acting as breakwaters, and also the floating fields. So that is just a very, outline idea about how you could do it. But it's not just Pacific or seas or oceans that can benefit. I mean, this year we've had, so these photographs are 3 examples of catastrophic floods this year in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nigeria, where residential communities have lost everything. They've lost their homes, they've lost their agriculture. These are primarily agricultural communities. They've lost their livelihood. So something needs to be done about designing floating fields. And so just as a slightly crazy idea, I came up with this. It's basically a floating carpet which is designed to be buoyant and create a series of plant trenches between the pillows which are buoyant, and that these could be built, one hopes, fairly cheaply and floated into place and then planted out. And that's typically the structure. Essentially it's like, bubble wrap that you use to wrap packages in before sending them off. It's really like giant bubble wrap. Right? Huge pillows of air connected together in such a way that the series of grid lines form the furrows, if you like, or the lines which you build up with soil and then grow your plants on that. It has to be designed to take the swell of the ocean so it's flexible in every direction. Very simple concept, we've got the weight of the thing being balanced by the water displacement, and then you have a reserve. Very simple calculation. And then you have some kind of edge detail to stop the swell spilling into the plant areas, which you don't want to do. So that's a half-hour idea from about a couple of weeks ago. So I just threw that in to show you, really, the sort of things that architects can dream up with, really as alternatives, using their design abilities to approach the problems from a completely different standpoint that has been used up to this point, and go forward with completely innovative ideas which can be put into practice, developed as prototypes very quickly. You can go actually straight from this sketch to a prototype about the size of this room. and put it on a lake or a river somewhere and see if it works. And forget, you know, a major design and engineering effort. Just do it. This is the sort of thing that needs to be got underway. So, conclusions for architects and engineers, just to sum up. Countermeasures against sea level rises must solve two problems at the same time. First, they must respond to and combat rising sea levels as they happen. But secondly, they must focus on construction methodologies that achieve carbon negative or at least carbon neutral footprints. And that means not pouring vast quantities of concrete into the sea and hoping that that will solve the problem. Sea barriers and sea walls should be built vertically in phases, synchronized with sea level rises over the century ahead. In other words, don't go and build a huge structure 10 meters high, the height of this room to begin with, if you don't know what the future is going to be. You design it in such a way that you can increase it incrementally, like building a Lego set, right? Building a wall out of Lego. And that will help to reduce the initial costs and spread the total cost burden over several decades, which makes it a much more acceptable thing to do politically and financially and economically to begin with. Floating homes can be a major part of the solution. They can make use of three sources of natural energy: sun, wind, and tide. Properly designed, these three sources, working individually and together, can provide all the energy needs of water development. In other words, we cut ourselves off from traditional infrastructure, from drainage disposal, from gas supply, from electrical supply, and we try to use what nature can provide in coastal areas, abundant nature from tides, wind, and the sun, together, synthesized together to solve the relatively low energy requirements of a typical family home. Rising sea levels and increasing floods bring an opportunity for architects to design floating homes and other survivable structures. They must be naturally buoyant, inherently lightweight, ecologically friendly, physically durable, and operationally safe. Safety is a very big thing. Safety is perhaps the one area that is a major challenge that doesn't necessarily occur in buildings built on land, because you have the added issue of building in a highly hostile environment, which is in a floating situation with seawater. So that increases the safety concerns and the risk. And finally, architects and engineers in practice, as well as students of schools of architecture and engineering, should take up the challenge and explore the potential of designing on water, starting right now. Thank you. Ask a question. Yes. Do you want this? Well, in the case of the UK, I mean, I don't live in the UK anymore, but I do follow what goes on there. There isn't one. There simply isn't an approach, and this is part of the problem. And I was saying earlier that the issue is just coming onto the radar of governments now. So if you look at the state of Florida, where you have Miami, a big town that is now being flooded on a regular basis, where the state government is beginning to take action through remedial measures for that state, which has a very large coastline. So it's being handled in bits and pieces around the world at the moment. Where you've got a problem that's emerging, local communities try to do something about it, or not, as the case may be. And local governments have to get involved because it becomes a political issue. if homeowners starting to lose very expensive homes in places like Miami, or insurance companies are refusing to reinsure homes because of the risk. So they turn to the local government and say, what are you going to do for us? So this issue is just coming on to governments around the world. I don't know what the situation in the Netherlands is. I suspect they're far ahead of everybody else. But at this point, I think looking at it from a worldwide perspective, not much organization anywhere.
Okay, so if there are no any other questions, I would like to thank you for your great lecture, and I would like to invite everyone downstairs to Archa to after party and enjoy having a beer and so on. So thank you very much.